Hi, I'm Tracy Lawson. I'm here today to talk about my book, Answering Liberty's Call, Anna Stone's Daring Ride to Valley Forge. It's based on a true story, and it stars my 6 times great-grandparents who lived in Fauquier County and I believe were married in Culpeper County. So it's kind of a nice little hometown project for you all, and I'm happy to be here to share today using family lore as the basis for a historical novel. I'm going to share my screen. And get myself all set here. There we go. All right. Women of every age and economic level participated in the American Revolution. Some left diaries and letters detailing their experiences, and others' stories have been preserved and passed by word of mouth by their families. Even what we know of the female icons like Betsy Ross, Molly Pitcher, Sybil Ludington, and the Quaker spy Lydia Darrah is based largely on hearsay, and their deeds were not known outside their families until many years after their deaths. There's no proof that Betsy Ross stitched the first American flag, only a story recounted by her grandson, William Canby, in 1870. Canby's claim was published in Harper's New Monthly magazine in 1873, and it was soon added to the history curriculum taught to millions of elementary school children each year. Though the descendants of Mary Ludwig Hayes did ample research, historians who made independent review of their compiled evidence say that Hayes's identity as Molly Pitcher cannot be confirmed. Molly Pitcher is believed to be a conglomerate of several women who served alongside their husbands in battle. Well, there we go. We have a little technical problem. There. The story of 16-year-old Sybil Ludington's 40-mile ride on a rainy night to rouse the militia in Danbury, Connecticut, was passed down in her family and first mentioned in a book about her father, Colonel Henry Ludington, which was published in 1907. And accounts of elderly Lydia Darrah's clandestine visit to General Washington before the Battle of White Marsh in December 1777 differs depending on who's telling the story. So the Women History blog notes that regardless of the specific facts, the central point is that because of Lydia Darrah's bravery, Washington and his troops were able to prepare for battle, and General Howe's army was thrown off guard when Washington and his troops confronted them. We cling to the cherished tales of the women who took part in the American Revolution. Much of our history from the period is enhanced by legend and clouded by time, and primary source verification is very hard to come by. Over in York, Pennsylvania, they have their own cherished story, Lafayette's Toast, which is an important scene in my book. Vincent Aquino, Sybil Ludington's biographer, asserts in his book, Patriot Hero of the Hudson Valley, The Life and Ride of Sybil Ludington, that if a source that provided information about the subject was alive during the subject's lifespan, the source's information likely came from a primary witness to the event. And sometimes that's all the better that we can do. Such is the case with Anna Asbury Stone, my 6 times great-grandmother. In 1778, war was men's business, but that didn't stop her from getting involved in the fight for liberty. The story of Anna Asbury Stone was published as a pamphlet by the DAR, and the story goes, when Anna's husband Benjamin, a young Baptist preacher, prepares to depart for the army, he takes Anna and their 3 young children to stay at her father's house. Benjamin and Anna's brothers enlist with Buford's unit of the 3rd Virginia, and they depart. When Anna hears of the hardship suffered by the soldiers at Valley Forge, she packs what she can carry on her fine saddle horse Nellie and sets out along rough roads bound for the army camp. The Continental Congress had fled Philadelphia the previous autumn and taken up residence in York. While she is there, Anna meets a congressman who asks her to carry a message to General Washington containing information about a conspiracy against him. Anna agrees to take the letter, and on the road the next day, she's stopped by a rider who claims the congressman has changed his mind and he wants that letter back. Well, distrustful, Anna boldly refuses and puts her whip to her horse. She arrives at the army camp ahead of her pursuer, where she's reunited with Benjamin and delivers the message that allows Washington to thwart the plans of his enemies. After spending the weekend in camp, Anna returns to Virginia under the escort of a detail of soldiers that includes her husband. The detail then fetches Lady Washington and brings her to Valley Forge in time to celebrate the commander's birthday in February. An earlier written account of Anna's adventures, which was published in a genealogical journal in 1903, states that in the days following her return from Valley Forge, the story was told over and over as the neighbors came in. For a long time, she was the hero of the whole community. Her children, her grandchildren, and her great-grandchildren used to gather about her knees and listen as she told them the tale of that eventful ride. Anna and Benjamin lived with their son, Jeremiah, in their declining years. Jeremiah's son, Benjamin Butler Stone, was one of those grandchildren who gathered around to hear the stories of his grandparents' youth directly from them. In turn, Benjamin Butler Stone told the story of Anna's ride to his children and grandchildren. Two of his granddaughters, Mary Augusta Stone and Harry Allura Bassett Stone, organized a Daughters of the American Revolution chapter in Cambridge, Ohio, in Anna's name in 1923, which was nearly a century and a half after the events in her story transpired. To mark the occasion of the chapter's founding, Harriet, the first chapter historian, penned that account of Anna's ride that I used as the basis for my novel. Now, my research revealed that Harriet's version of Anna's story had some discrepancies, but it provided an excellent basis for a novel while leaving me lots of room to develop relationships between the characters and imagine all kinds of hardships and dangers Anna might encounter on her journey. Unlike Benjamin Butler Stone and many of my distant cousins, I did not grow up hearing the legend of Anna's ride. I came across it on Ancestry.com in 2013 while compiling family stories into a book for my parents' 50th wedding anniversary. At the time, I was writing another book series and I didn't think about Anna's story again for several years. But in the fall of 2017, after the release of the final book in my series for young adults, I took a breather from writing with no clear plan for a new project. Well, that December, we were listening to a podcast while driving to visit friends in Ohio. And when the host said, "We rarely see history from a woman's point of view," I thought, golly, I'm a writer. I should do something about that. Well, I grabbed a pen and a pad of paper from my purse, and because Anna and her story popped into my head, and I scribbled pages of notes before we arrived at our destination. So the next day, I reached out to Shayla Ellenberger, who was then the regent of the Anna Ashbury Stone DAR chapter, to discuss the project. As a historian, I want the facts. I will dig and dig to find what I'm after, and when I'm thwarted, I just regroup and try again. When I lack hard proof, I try to build a case in support of the truths I seek. Now, novelization requires the author to expand upon the facts or the legend, as the case may be, and craft a storyline that builds the action and the tension and leads to the expected climax. With a historical novel, the end is already written, which is awesome sometimes because endings are hard, and the readers often know the end of the story before they begin to read the book. The author's job in that case is to take the reader on an engaging and, if possible, unexpected journey to the expected end. As I began my research, I sought the answers to two questions. Why did Anna undertake such a dangerous journey? And what was in the letter that she carried to General Washington? Well, one discrepancy in the written accounts of Anna's journey led me to discover why she would decide to set off on such a dangerous and even a foolish journey. Anna could not have stayed at her father's when Benjamin was away with the army because Anna's father, George Asbury, died in 1758 when Anna was just 9 years old. In colonial America, children whose fathers were dead were considered orphans, regardless of whether their mother was still living. The laws governing widows and orphans dictated that court-appointed guardians would manage orphans' inheritances, educations, and dowries, often to the exclusion of the mother's wishes. So children without an attractive inheritance or a relative that could support them could be bound out in apprenticeships or as indentured servants. I found a copy of George Asbury's will inventory. He died without making a will, but they came and did an assessment of his assets, and he was worth about 50 pounds when he died. He owned no land. He owned no enslaved peoples. His 50 pounds worth of household goods were not likely to be something that would support a young family. And so I'm sure that Anna and her siblings and her mother were plunged into poverty very quickly. That 50 pounds is about $9,000 in today's money. So knowing that she likely suffered hardships as a child, I placed my character Anna in an indenture when she was a child, which allowed me to explore what it might have been like for children and teens in that situation. And it forced my Anna to grow up away from her nuclear family. So as a grown woman, she does not view her mother, her uncle, and her aunt as authority figures. Instead, she exhibits a great deal of independence and a bit of a rebellious streak, which is exactly what you want when you're crafting a heroine. Now, Anna's the star of the book. Her character and her voice came to me from the beginning, but I struggled to understand Benjamin. How could I make a country preacher who was present only in flashbacks for the bulk of the novel, dashing enough to be worthy of Anna's fierce devotion? Well, the more research I did, the more I learned about Benjamin, and I was delighted to discover that he and his fellow Baptist ministers were at the forefront of a movement to establish freedom of religion and the separation of long before those ideas became an inexorable part of our nation's framework. Prior to the American Revolution, no British colony was as protective of its established church, and none abused its religious dissenters more than Virginia. Arrest and detainment, destruction of property, and harassment were common. In the novel, Benjamin refers to his marriage to Anna as an act of rebellion. The established church refused to recognize marriages performed by anyone other than an Anglican parish priest. And dissenters' unions were not recorded in the county courthouse, which is likely why I can find no record of Benjamin and Anna's wedding. But because they named their first son Elijah Craig Stone, after the outlaw preacher Elijah Craig, who was Benjamin's mentor, I suspect it was he who solemnized their marriage. So Benjamin and his brother Thomas both signed the 10,000 Names Petition, which was put before the Virginia General Assembly in October 1776 and called for an end to compulsory tithes to the Anglican Church and the persecution of dissenters. The petition made clear that Baptist support of the war hinged on the government's willingness to grant religious freedom to those who wished to worship outside the Anglican Church. The petition was a strategic move. Virginia needed recruits, and it appealed to all of its clergy, even those dissenters, to help fill enlistment quotas. So Baptist leaders like Benjamin recognized that independence from the crown would weaken the Church of England's hold on Virginia and lead to the religious liberty that he craved. So he and others encouraged the men of their congregations to enlist and fought alongside them. Okay, so now we've got the motivation for both of the main characters, right? Anna is worried that if she loses Benjamin and all three of her brothers, she'll have no one to advocate for her and her children. She'll end up right back where she was, plunged into poverty, but this time it will be her small children who will suffer. So that, to me, was why she embarked on this crazy journey. And of course, Benjamin is following his convictions because he feels that, separation of church and state is very important. And the only way to get Baptists to be able to worship in freedom is to get rid of the Church of England. So, all right, moving forward. The story takes place in Virginia and Pennsylvania, two places I have never lived. So I use maps of the period to locate the characters' homes, determine Anna's route, and to estimate the distance between towns on the existing roads, and choose places that Anna might have visited or stayed on her journey. Now on Ancestry.com, I found a description of her Uncle William Asbury's property in county deed records. Because Uncle William's family and Anna's family seemed to move west from Stafford to Fauquier County about the same time, I believe that they moved as a family group. So it's likely that she lived on or near Uncle William's property. So I found the description of his property, but I couldn't figure out exactly where it was located. So when I visited the county courthouse in Warrenton, I gave the description I had downloaded to the supervisor in the map room, and she soon found the original 1724 land grant and was able to tell me where the 300-acre parcel was located. It's still intact, and it's currently a horse farm. Now, if you see where the blue arrow is pointing, there's kind of a pie-shaped piece, and that is where Uncle William's land was located. And it's still, like I said, you can drive out there. It's on Benjamin Harrison Drive in the northern part of Fauquier. So the Chronicle of Thomas Stone of Hamilton Parish by William Stone, my cousin, had maps that pinpoint the location of Benjamin's father's land, which had large apple and peach orchards and was bordered by Carter's Run on the west and Cliff Mills Road on the east. And that is the approximate area where the red arrow points. When I visited these sites, it drove home that my characters were real people and that they and their families had lived and breathed and walked on this land, and they did not exist just in my imagination. Now, the photo on your left is the view from Uncle William's land, looking south, and the photo on the right is Carter's Run. Once I had Anna's route mapped with places for her to stop each night, I drove from Warrenton, Virginia to Valley Forge. Along the way, I took photos and made note of the terrain and the natural features so I could craft believable descriptions of what she would have seen. I noted landmarks, contemporary businesses, and residents who might be given cameo appearances or enlisted as supporting characters. And of course, I paid special attention to York, Pennsylvania, as I knew several scenes in the book would take place there. and especially at the Golden Plough and the Horatio Gates house. So to further flesh out Anna's story, I relied on what was happening in the geographic areas in which she traveled. What were the local sentiments about the war, and what kinds of difficulties did people face? Well, I learned that several towns in Virginia were plagued by armed mobs who would ride in and demand salt, and who assaulted and terrorized shopkeepers when they could not get what they wanted. In Pennsylvania, a British foraging detail commandeered barrels of flour from a miller without paying. The miller did not protest, but he neglected to mention that the barrels were not full of flour, but the lime he had purchased to whitewash his mill's interior. In East Vincent Township in Chester County, there is a small cemetery with a monument dedicated to 22 soldiers of the Revolution who died of a fever in the Dutch Reformed Church during the winter of 1778. I had learned of this cemetery while writing another book that I published in 2012. And as I drove Anna's route, I got to East Vincent Township and I thought, I know where I am. And Anna would have ridden right by that church while those soldiers were still alive. So of course, I took that information that I had and I used it as a scene in the opening chapter of the book. Vignettes like those add authentic touches to the narrative and build the world the characters inhabit. And I did my best to include as much factual information as I possibly could. Well, how relieved Anna must have been to reach Valley Forge. With her missions accomplished, she spent a few days with her husband and brothers before heading back home. And when I inquired about where she might stay during her visit, the historian at Valley Forge told me, oh, she'd just be in the hut with her husband and the other 11 soldiers. Well, you know, as an author, that felt a bit awkward, and to have that long-awaited reunion between my main characters in such meager accommodations. But, you know, so I prevailed, and true love and a sense of humor are what I used to craft Anna and Benjamin's time together at the Army camp. In 1778, I found that, you know, people, let me back up a second. This is inside one of the enlisted men's huts at Valley Forge, and the photo on the right shows a triple-decker bunk bed. And you see there's not a whole lot of room in between, and it was really quite crowded. But they said only 6 soldiers slept at a time, so, you know. In 1778, Americans faced many of the same problems they do now, which made for some interesting parallels in my story. Though I could not foresee a future when I began writing this book, I chose the fear of epidemics and infectious disease as a theme. In colonial America, people lived all their lives with the fear of smallpox and other infectious diseases, just as we have experienced over the past few years with the pandemic. During the Revolutionary War, more Continental soldiers died of disease than from battle wounds. Many of the men who volunteered for service had grown up on remote farms and had never been exposed to smallpox or other infectious diseases until they arrived in camp. Inoculation against smallpox was illegal in Virginia, and it was controversial in every state. The Army struggled to contain outbreaks, but in the early years of the war, the disease ravaged new recruits while Washington sought dispensation from state governors to inoculate his troops. The practice of inoculation was known in the colonies. Winismus, an African slave owned by the Massachusetts minister Cotton Mather, introduced the concept 60 years earlier in 1716. You may recognize the name Cotton Mather from the Salem witchcraft trials, and it's kind of interesting to think how little time elapsed between the Salem witchcraft hysteria in 1692 and where we are now in the 1770s. Winismus insisted that whoever had the courage to take the inoculation against smallpox would be forever free of the fear of contagion. Well, rather than embracing this knowledge, many people reacted in fear. Even Mather questioned whether Winismus's motives were to protect or to harm his white masters. And of course, it was far riskier to inoculate with the live virus than with the vaccines that were developed later using cowpox. I also addressed the ever-present issue of government corruption, and that went to the heart of my second question. What was in that message that Anna carried? Well, our high school US history classes may have led us to believe that General Washington was universally revered. But in truth, Washington faced resistance and threats from within his army and the government that had pledged to support him as commander-in-chief. I had never heard of the Conway Cabal until my research yielded an eye-opening amount of information. Named for General Thomas Conway, the cabal included disgruntled members of Congress and the Board of War who wished to remove Washington and make General Horatio Gates, the so-called hero of the Battle of Saratoga, commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Through the fall and winter of 1777 and 78, The Board of War did more to criticize Washington than to provide relief and supplies to the soldiers. But loyal members of Congress, recognizing the discord, fed information to Washington and his inner circle about the factions that were plotting against him. Historian Thomas Fleming noted, "Whoever supplies the army controls the army." Quartermaster General Thomas Mifflin, one of the members of the cabal, did very much damage when he walked away from his post in October 1777 and left the army supply chains in complete disarray. And I'm sure we can all relate. We all know what it feels like when supply chains go crazy and you can't get the things that you need. Mifflin was directly responsible for much of the suffering at Valley Forge. Henry Lawrence, who was then president of Congress, believed the cabal sought a return to the ancient rule as a contrite and cowed British colony. Now, I'm not going to tell you the end of the story because it is a very well-known part of American history, and I'm sure you can probably guess that everything turned out okay because we're not a British colony and we became Americans. But though I compiled a great deal of evidence to support Anna's story, I wasn't able to find everything that I hoped to. But my research continued after the book was published, and sometimes discoveries are happy accidents. I was doing research for my next book, which is a nonfiction entitled Historic Mills of West Virginia. And I was in Hampshire County, West Virginia, where the courthouse records have never been digitized. That is like a treasure hunt with treasure, because you never know what you're going to find, and it's not something you can find in online records. And I made some notable discoveries. One thing I found was that Anna had a sister, Jemima, who was not mentioned in any other family records. She was named an heir, though, in their brother Joseph's will. And the Hampshire County court records revealed that Jemima's husband, George Howell, was killed at the Battle of Waxhaws, also known as Buford's Defeat, in 1780. Jemima was left a widow with 6 children, one of whom was blind, and the court determined that she was in necessitous circumstances to receive a pension out of the public taxes. So here's an example of someone who was in such dire straits that she was supported by the city. And that's very unusual because, as I said before, tax rolls were small, communities were small. They did not have the infrastructure to support the indigent. And so it was most important to make sure that everyone was productive and working. And it may seem cruel to take children away from their parents and put them into indentures, but that was considered the most expedient way to allow the society to function at its best way. But occasionally, people like Jemima did receive public assistance. Jemima was listed as a member of Benjamin's congregation at Crooked Run Baptist Church in Hampshire County, Virginia in 1790. And documents related to Joseph's estate led to more discoveries. An article of agreement filed between Anna and Benjamin and their son, Jeremiah, in 1825, authorized Jeremiah to sell the land his parents had inherited from Joseph and to use the proceeds for their maintenance and care in their twilight years. Jeremiah was also charged with escorting 2 enslaved women that were part of the inheritance from Virginia to Ohio so Benjamin could sign their emancipation papers. Virginia law at the time allowed for emancipation only if the emancipator paid to carry the newly freed people out of the state. This confirmed Benjamin and Anna's abolitionist convictions, and I was glad to know that I had portrayed them accurately in the book. Now, earlier in my talk, I showed you the gravestone for Anna and Benjamin. Now, that's not their original gravestone. That stone was placed in the 1980s by a Daughters of the American Revolution chapter in Union Cemetery in Cadiz, Ohio. That's Harrison County. It's kind of on the eastern border between Ohio and Pennsylvania and West Virginia. Now, that's where they died, and they were buried in a private cemetery that was basically you couldn't find it by the 1960s. So the DAR put up that headstone. But I discovered that they've got Benjamin's death date wrong on there. A probate form assigning Benjamin and Anna's grandson, Benjamin Williamson, as an administrator of his estate was dated August 7th, 1829, which proved Benjamin's accepted death date of June 4th, 1833 is incorrect. And I'm sure that the discrepancy comes because Anna and Benjamin's son, Benjamin Jr., was wounded in the War of 1812, and he never quite recovered, and he died as a young man in 1833. And so I'm sure that that's where the discrepancy came about. Also, to support this, a deed filed in Hampshire County dated August 1830 refers to Anna Stone as widow and relict of Benjamin Stone, deceased. The 1830 federal census for Harrison County, Ohio also supports this, as it shows a woman above the age of 80 living in Jeremiah Stone's household, but no man in the same age range. But the story remains the same. And even though there are little discrepancies, we move forward to honor Anna and her story with as much information as we had. And one of the articles written about her said, and I know I'm covering this up partly, the part she had in the breaking up of this infamous conspiracy was not at the time understood by her. She was only doing her duty, but she was an important factor in overturning this dark scheme that unfolded at a time of America's greatest peril, and was indeed a heroine of the war. Though I will move on to other writing projects, I may never exhaust my search for information about Anna and Benjamin Stone, for who knows what else is yet to be discovered. If you have any information, please contact me through the Museum of Culpeper History, because I would love to get in touch with people who have information about these families that haven't resided in the area for a very long time, but you never know what's out there. Now, before I go, I also want to show you Anna's wedding gown. After my book went to the publisher, we were in one of the first lockdowns for COVID, and I was looking for something to do, and I wanted to feel as in touch with my characters I possibly could. So I decided I would make an approximation of her wedding gown. And that's what's behind me. Is this dress is, I'm going to tilt down a little bit so you can see it better, is a polonaise, and it has a pocket, and the skirt is, the red skirt is separate from the yellow, and the yellow in the back has puffs that you can draw up or have come down as a train. And it was a lot of fun to make this. It took me a couple months of stitching it wholly by hand, no sewing machines involved, because I wanted to do it in the techniques of the time. So I will also send some photos of that along so that they can be posted. But I appreciate your attention. I hope you learned something from my talk about Anna and Benjamin, and also about the process of novelizing a family story. Thank you very much.